My baby's name was George Robert. Things I remember about him most of all. The first was that throughout the entire pregnancy, I was absolutely convinced he would be blonde like me. I don't know why. It's the recessive gene. My husband has dark brown hair, but I just assumed 100% he'd be blonde. And he was born with a full head of dark brown hair, which surprised me. And the other thing was that leading up to his birth, the weather was unseasonably warm, beautiful sunny days, pure blue skies every day for what seemed like weeks on end. And then he died 5 days before his due date. And on his due date, the 6th of June, the weather absolutely turned. It got really cold and there was a thunderstorm. And I remember sitting and staring out the window and watching the rain pour down and just think, this is so perfect. I couldn't stand, a happy sunny day on what was the saddest day for me. And it felt like the world was grieving with me somehow. And I don't know, it felt like a very fitting weather turn to mark what should have been a very joyful day.
Welcome to Still a Part of Us, a place where moms and dads share the story of their child who was stillborn or who died in infancy. I'm Winter.
And I'm Lee. We are grateful you joined us today. Please note that this is a story of loss and has triggers.
Thanks to our lost parents who are willing to be vulnerable and share their children with us.
If you're listening to this podcast, just know that on our YouTube channel there are pictures and videos that are related to the stories that are being shared.
Subscribe and share it with a friend that might need it and tell them to subscribe. Why? Because people need to know that even though our babies are no longer with us, they're still a part of us. We are so grateful to have Miranda on with us today to talk about her son, George. This is actually kind of a fun experience to get to know Miranda, so I'm excited to have you on today, Miranda. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
So tell us a little bit about yourself, Miranda. Who you're married to, where you guys are living right now, what you do on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, sure. So my husband's name is Graham, and we just celebrated our 8th wedding anniversary on the 13th of April.
Congratulations.
Sorry, 16th of April. I don't know why I just said that. It was in 2013. We are originally from Canada. We moved to London, England 6 years ago. Both of us had job opportunities that came up around the same time. And it was not in our life plan. We had just got married. We just bought a house, lived in that house for approximately a year. It was very much the plan was to stay in Toronto where we lived. And we just kind of packed it all up and fled with the intention of staying in London for 2 years. And that was 6 years ago. We both changed jobs a couple times since moving to London, but broadly my role has been in the world of public relations. I've worked in all sorts, but started in consumer PR, so for large consumer businesses, and then transitioned into health and fitness PR specifically, which is very much my area of expertise and my passion. And my husband's done a fairly significant career pivot after a career in mining.
Oh,
He went and did an MBA at the London Business School and decided he wanted to get into the world of food tech, which is where he's working now. So plant proteins and alternative meat. Yeah.
very interesting. Oh. And so you guys have just found yourself in London, and do you enjoy living there? Has it been good for you?
It's been amazing. I think, we wouldn't have stayed for 3 times the length of time if it wasn't. I think we were really naive when we first moved to London, thinking that after 2 years we would have done it all and seen it all, made all these friends and could have just packed up and moved to Toronto. I mean, I think it really took us 2 years to feel like we lived in London, and to make some solid friendships. And so by the time that had happened, it seemed like a shame to reverse it all. And so we stayed. But the city's amazing. I mean, there's everything, food, entertainment, events. And I think a big thing for us was proximity to the rest of Europe, and an opportunity to travel extensively, which we've done over the last 6 years.
Which is so wonderful. And you kind of alluded to this, that you are very much into the you do PR for a fitness company. I know that you are a big runner, if I'm not mistaken. Tell me a little bit how long you've been running, and do you do that on is that like a pretty big hobby for you?
So running was a huge part of my life. I started running in my late 20s. A friend of mine was the leader of a local running club and basically invited me to come and join at a time where I'd never really put 2 feet in front of the other. I really enjoyed it, so I kept going back. And as part of the group she was in, they wanted 2 new runners to train for and run their first half marathon and blog about it in exchange for free clothes and shoes. So I thought, yeah, why not?
Why not?
I had every intention of running one half marathon and saying that was that. Got my free shoes. I'm out of here. And obviously, you know where this story goes, but I fell in love with it. It suddenly just awakened this desire to see how far I could go. If I can do this, how much more can I run? How much faster can I get? How much further can I go? And it was just this massive source of pride and accomplishment for me. So I continued, and over the last decade or so, slightly less than a decade, I've run over 55 different races,
Oh my goodness.
including 2 full marathons, 5 triathlons. I would say still very much a recreational runner, but posted some times in the past, couple of years that I would have thought inconceivable in my early days. So I think there was something really rewarding about getting older and still being able to improve.
Yeah.
So uh, I say it was a big part of my life. I think it's sort of dropped down the priorities these days, but it'll be there for when I want it back again.
Yeah, exactly. That's the nice thing about it. And do you guys it sounds like as a couple, you guys like to travel. Any other things that you like to do in London or around?
um, Definitely travel, but eat. I think there's no shortage of amazing cuisine in London. I think it gets painted with a bad brush. People think that English food is just a bunch of fish and chips and fried stuff. And I mean, if you want that, you can have it. But it's also a very worldly city where if you want any type of cuisine from anywhere around the world, you can get it.
Right.
So I think sort of nights out with friends and enjoying great food either in their homes or at a restaurant has been a huge part of our social calendar. And I think just the entertainment side of things, I mean, there's aside from the obvious theaters and kind of West End shows, there are just so many interesting events that you can go to, whether it's festivals or secret cinemas or interactive art exhibits. I mean, it's endless. You could find something to fill your weekend every week if you wanted.
That's so fun. I think that is great. And thank you for letting us know, because I think you're technically our first international guest. So welcome.
Hey, all right.
Yeah. For a little bit of context, can you also tell us how long ago George was born at the time of this recording?
It was coming up on 11 months ago.
Yep, it's right, June.
So it was June of 2020.
Right. Okay. So it's you and your husband Graham and any other members of the family. It's just the two of you, right?
It's just us and a puppy who joined us in December of last year, whose
Okay.
name is Eddie.
Wonderful. So were you guys planning on getting pregnant then? Was that part of the kind of the big picture, or was that something that was a little bit of a surprise?
It was not a surprise. I think we really, as a couple, I don't want to say struggled, but certainly postponed the idea of starting a family for quite a long time. We liked our lives. We liked
Yeah.
the freedom of being able to pack up and travel and do whatever we wanted when we wanted. And it was really difficult for us to envision a life where that was suddenly came to a standstill. And so I think, and both, I think at the same time, both being very career focused, we were busy
Mm-hmm.
and it was hard to imagine how a baby would fit into our lives. So we really delayed our thinking around starting a family for quite a while. But I think with sort of, complete predictability, the second I turned 35, I suddenly felt like, okay, like I'm ready now and we need to start we need to start because, obviously there's no reason to believe that we would have any issues. And I wasn't concerned about any fertility challenges, but I think, age being a factor
Hmm.
certainly weighed on my mind. And I sort of felt like it was now or never. Um, I think the other thing is that I'm an only child. And I always said my whole life that I would want to have two kids. And so it was, trying to plot that timeline. I'm a bit of a control freak. So trying to plan how that would look, really sort of thought, okay, at 35, we've got to start the process. And I think, we took a very sort of laid back approach to it. It's not like, we weren't tracking anything. We just sort of, I don't know if they say this in other countries, but pulled the goalie, as they say. And and just thought, if it happens, it happens,
Yeah.
and that's how it'll be. And so it wasn't a quick process because, as it turns out, it's really actually hard to make a baby.
Yes.
You
Yes.
spend your whole life, worried that you're going to get pregnant by accident. And when it comes down to it, it's like some Einstein level science experiment where, the moon has to align with something or another.
Yeah.
And anyway, it eventually happened. And a month before my 36th birthday, found out that I was pregnant.
Awesome. Were you guys excited? Was that just, you're like, okay, we've been planning for this. How did you feel about that?
Um, I I remember the day that I told Graham I was pregnant. I did the test in the morning before work, and it was positive. And I came and told him, and we both kind of went, "Huh, all right, well, I gotta go. We'll talk later." And it was like the most anticlimactic thing. There was no, celebration, jumping up and down. It was kind of like, "Okay, this is a thing we'll deal with later."
Yeah.
Um, so I wouldn't say the initial emotion was one of overwhelming excitement. Um, I think there was, certainly happiness, but also an element of being terrified as well. This is suddenly everything is going to change.
Yeah.
Um, so we, so we did eventually talk about it, and I think, as time went on, became more and more excited. But yeah, certainly it was scary. I think we were mostly focused on how our lives would change.
Yeah. Because it is a big change when a child comes into your life. And how was the pregnancy? Were you, I would say that you are relatively fit. And so I'm just wondering how the pregnancy went, morning sickness. How did the baby
Yeah.
look?
Overall, I would say my pregnancy was really smooth and really easy. I had really intense food aversions in
Mm.
the first
Hmm.
trimester, which caught me a bit by surprise. I thought I knew about morning sickness, obviously. I didn't know that I would literally feel like retching at the smell of my own refrigerator, and subsisted on a diet of bagels and crackers for probably 12 weeks.
Yeah.
It also made hiding the pregnancy from people at that time extremely difficult, knowing both my love of food and my high level of activity. When suddenly I start acting like a sloth and eating nothing but carbs, it was a rather difficult thing to hide. I'm sure most people had a suspicion before I ever mentioned it, but um, yeah. Otherwise, I think as soon as I passed the first trimester, I felt great. I had a high level of energy. I continued running until I was 25 weeks pregnant, I think. Carried on with a fairly high intensity fitness schedule, group exercise classes, modified, of course. And I also worked with a personal trainer who specialized in prenatal fitness, just to make sure that I have a tendency to push myself too hard all the time. And so I needed someone to kind of pull me back
Oh, gotcha.
and make sure that I was still exercising safely.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, but yeah, and we still traveled. We went to Mauritius when I was probably about 26 weeks, maybe 24 weeks pregnant, and had a luxurious holiday at this beautiful resort. And then in March of 2020, we went to France, and my friends went skiing. I snowshoed,
Oh.
and booked a massage therapist to come to the chalet and massage me. So it was all very luxurious.
Yes, that sounds nice.
Yeah. So, yeah, and I didn't have any issues. I was very mobile, I don't know, I felt good. I felt great. There was certainly no warning signs that anything would go badly.
Yeah. I am not totally sure if how healthcare is in London or in the UK, but do they generally also do kind of a anatomy ultrasound around 20 weeks? Is that a fairly common
Yeah.
practice still?
Yes. So I think similar to most places, they do a 12 and 20-week
Hmm.
scan. My particular hospital also offered a 36-week scan, but due to COVID, it was canceled. So I never actually had that one. But I think potentially, unlike other countries, I don't know this for sure, but there's lots of private care options where there's several clinics that will do private scans for
Mm.
a fairly reasonable price. So if you are concerned, you can book what's called a reassurance scan and go in and have another scan
Oh, okay.
at your cost, of course.
Right,
But
right.
um, it's certainly affordable, I think, for most people. And I think, what's the price of reassurance? So
Yeah, yeah. So you guys got your scans at 12 weeks and at 20 weeks, and how was George looking at that time? At both of
great.
those times, looking good.
He looked great. He was, I mean, it was, I think we totally took for granted at the time, but I went into all of those appointments assuming that it would all be, everything is fine, all graphs trending upward, everything is perfect, and it was. So I always left feeling quite smug that, everything was great and therefore everything would be great.
Yeah, I know. It's like, so tell us a little bit. So you, just to kind of back up a little bit, I just want to point out that you had George basically in the middle of the pandemic, like, and it was probably full, like you guys had shut down. I mean, I think the UK had shut down quite a bit of stuff by June, May, June.
Yeah.
And
So
so,
in just
oh,
to set the sort of timeline, I think I was entering my third trimester
mm-hmm,
in March of 2020. So
okay,
right when the world was basically pulling the panic alarm on COVID, and I left work the afternoon of, I think, March 17th or so, uh, thinking it would be, a couple weeks and I'd be back, and it was the last time I was ever in the office.
right,
I haven't been back since. Everything shut down, like fully locked down after that. And it was, at first it was, kind of a funny, I don't want to say novelty, but it was this sort of bizarro world
yeah,
that everyone assumed would be temporary. And it was made bearable by the fact that the weather was beautiful.
oh, good,
We have a garden. I just thought, well, great. I'm working from home. I'm pregnant. I don't have to get on public transit. I'm just gonna lounge in the garden and drink, I don't know, iced tea while I, in between meetings. Um, it. I don't think initially I was terribly concerned. I think when things started to become more concerning was when obviously hospitals became overrun. The NHS was at a breaking point in terms of being able to accommodate all the critical patients. Of course, it didn't, it wouldn't have necessarily impacted maternity care, but what they did do in order to prevent more people from entering the hospital was to cancel what they called all non-essential appointments. So for anyone like me that was deemed low risk and healthy, pretty much all of my appointments, with the exception of one at 38 weeks, was canceled or done over the phone, which I was deeply concerned about at the time, because I thought, how on earth could they possibly know if something's going wrong with
hmm,
a phone call? It just, I panicked. I remember, calling multiple other hospitals to see if I could switch, but they all basically had the same rules in place, so there was
right,
no point. And I kept trying to tell myself that, if they have to make changes in an unprecedented situation. So if they tell me that this is the right thing to do, then, and that the risk of going into the hospital is greater than staying home, then I have to just believe that that is in fact true.
hmm. So you have had basically telephone appointments and or none at all basically for your last
Correct.
trimester. Were they
Yes.
having you do any sort of checks of say blood pressure or um so nothing extra?
No. No. So I think this is the other thing. I thought, normally they take blood or they check your
Mhm.
urine or
Mhm.
they do your blood pressure. None
Mhm.
of that was happening. They basically just asked how I was feeling. Uh, and I think the question that stays with me is the midwife who called me asked, "Are you happy with the baby's movements?" And I thought, like, what an absolutely absurd thing to ask a first time mom. And I said, I don't know what you mean. Like,
Yeah.
like, give me more to go on. What should I be looking for? And, I remember her sounding quite exasperated with me, like as if I was just wasting her time. And she just basically asked if the movements were regular, if I'd noticed any difference in the patterns. And at the time, I just thought, I mean, I'm not paying attention. Like, I was working, 15, 16-hour days because, working in the fitness industry when all of our clients had basically had to shut.
Yeah.
Our business was in a tailspin. We were trying to save clients who were leaving us in droves, and it was really stressful. The last thing I was paying attention to was counting my baby's movements. So I just sort of said, yeah, I guess so. And she said, great, okay, call us if anything changes. The conversation lasted 45 seconds.
So you're in your third trimester. You are told to note down I mean, it sounded like there was not very good direction given regarding what you're supposed to be looking for in regards to movement,
Not
and
particularly.
not particularly. And they are, and you are just kind of starting to get worried, right? I mean, I would be like you said, I would be panicking.
I panicked. I was properly panicked, and not just about the baby, but about all aspects of my life. What was going to happen with my company?
Mhm.
What was happening? Even it sounds trivial now, but fitness was such a huge part of my life, and all the places I would go
Are
to do classes were shut
shut. Yeah.
for the foreseeable. I mean, even our families, for travel, they live in Canada. They wanted to come visit us when the baby was born. Would that be possible?
Yeah.
I remember I was awake in the night. I couldn't sleep because I was so worried about things. And I woke up and I wrote feverishly, just wrote 6 pages of worries. And months later, I went back and looked at those, and it is shocking how many of those things actually happened. Most people say when you write down your worries that most of them end up not coming
Mhm.
to fruition. In this particular case, I would say 50% plus actually indeed did happen, which is a terrifying thing.
Yeah, it is. So tell me then what happened, tell me kind of what happened when you found out about George.
I mean, things carried on, through the third trimester. I did actually go to an appointment at 38 weeks, where everything appeared to be fine. Um, so then I carried on working right up until the end. I worked until the 30th of May. I think that was the right day. 30, well, something around there.
Mhm.
And I remember being, quite smug, having, done the best job I could. I was on great terms with my boss. We'd done a lot of great work together in order to kind of salvage, a lot of things
Right.
that were going wrong. So we had a friend over that evening, and we were having some food in the garden. I remember feeling quite smug. I could feel George moving around, and was feeling quite good about everything.
Mhm.
I woke up the next morning. I guess this was now June the 1st, which was Monday. It was my very first day of maternity leave, and I sat up in bed, and I remember I normally every morning when I would sit up in bed and I would have, my morning drink, that the baby would start moving. He'd start moving straight away. I'd start noticing his movements, especially if he could hear me or Graham
Mm.
talking. But this morning there was nothing. And I didn't panic, not straight away, because I knew not to. I'd read enough by this stage on my own and based on my own research that you shouldn't panic. And so I did everything that I was told to do. I had something cold to drink. I ate something sweet. I lay down on the couch and I tried to feel if I could feel any movements. And I still didn't believe that really that there was anything too wrong. So I had a shower, I dried my hair, and by this point more than an hour had gone by and I still hadn't felt anything. And I thought, I should go in just to be sure. I'm
Mhm.
sure it's fine, but I'll go in. And I told Graham not to come, even though I think he could have, despite the COVID restrictions. But I told him not to go because in that moment, I was sure that everything would be okay. And I remember getting in. I took an Uber to the hospital, and I remember on the way there, I don't know, just suddenly getting this increasing sense of dread. I even Googled, and I know I did this because the web page was still open on my phone weeks and weeks later. I Googled rate of stillbirth in the UK. Like I don't know, I just had a horrible, dreadful feeling that something was wrong. And I got to the maternity ward, and they still had me wait, even though I said I was concerned about the baby's movements. I still waited in the waiting room for 25 minutes
Oh.
before someone saw me. And then finally, a midwife came and put the Doppler on me and couldn't find anything. And that's when I really started to panic. And I kept shouting at her, is something wrong? Is something wrong? And she just kept telling me that it was fine and not to worry. And they brought in a different midwife and she checked and still nothing. And then they told me to move and I had to go to a different area where then they did a proper ultrasound with a more senior, I don't know if she was a midwife or an obstetrician, I'm not sure. And that's when she told me, well, she didn't actually need to tell me. I just remember looking at her, all three of them, there were three midwives there, they were all wearing masks because of COVID. And I just looked at her eyes and they were filled up with tears. And I knew before she even said anything. And she just said the words, "I'm so sorry." And I don't know, I kept screaming at her, "Are you sure? Are you sure?" And I demanding that she check again, over and over. And she kept telling me that she was so sorry that he had no heartbeat. And, after a few moments of trying to absorb this news, she told me that we had to go to a different room. And I mean, understandably, I was hysterical and we're separated by curtains in a room full of other pregnant women. Obviously, it's not a good scene. I couldn't function. I couldn't move. And then I obviously had to call Graham. I had to call him. How do you call your husband and tell him that your baby's dead? I somehow managed to get through to him, and I just shrieked something down the phone and then threw my phone at whoever was standing next to me and told them they had to sort it out. So they took me to this other room. And I remember sitting in there and just crying and just asking, "Are they sure? Are they sure?" And they kept telling me they could check again, but that, the woman who checked me is the most senior, I don't know what her title is, but senior, kind of ultrasound technician in the hospital. And that if she'd not seen a heartbeat, it was very unlikely that it would be any different. And I remember I kept asking, "What do we do now? What do I do? What do I do?" And they wouldn't answer me. I remember they just wouldn't tell me anything. They wouldn't speak to me other than just to sort of try to calm me, because I guess they wanted Graham to be there first. And in hindsight, that was the right thing to do, because I don't think I would have heard, or I would have heard, but I wouldn't have listened to anything they said. Anyway, eventually he arrived, and we talked about the different options. It was exceedingly difficult in that moment of extreme shock to try and make rational decisions about what to do next. They give you the sort of doctor's perspective of, you can have a C-section or you can be induced. And they give you a bunch of very sort of factual risks and benefits of each, but ultimately it's up to you to decide. And that's horrible, because all I wanted in that moment was for somebody to tell me what to do. So to force me to make decisions like that, I think was cruel and horrible. And equally, I think the worst thing is that even once we'd decided, it's not like it could happen immediately. We had to just go home. And this was, at this stage, maybe 10 o'clock in the morning. And we just had to go home to a house that had a baby's room completely set up and ready for a baby that was never going to use it. And just sit with that fact for an entire day and night that was the worst. I think people often say to me, that how awful they think certain things would have been, like the funeral or packing up his room or all these different things. But I think for me, that was the worst, having to turn around and leave the hospital and go home and just be there with that, I'm feeling completely helpless and out of control and not able to do anything to help myself or the baby that had died. It was the worst 30 hours of my entire life.
Did you guys decide to be induced or to have the C-section then?
I think that if they had told me that I could have had the C-section immediately, I would have done it, because I couldn't imagine the idea of what I've just described, of having to go home and just sit with that fact. But they said, regardless of what option I chose, it would have to be the following day. And they had explained that the induction would be both, or would be safer for me, and an easier recovery, and the safest option should we want to try and have children in the future. That seemed like a good enough reason to me. So that was what we decided, despite the fact that the thought of it was utterly inconceivable. But based on those facts alone, that's what we decided.
When Ram finally came, got there and everything, was he also in shock? I just imagine him getting the news on the other side of the phone. And do you know how he reacted?
It's really hard for me to remember because I was so in my own head. But I remember him running in, and he had my hospital bag. I remember the one that I had packed for going to the hospital if I was in labor. I don't know if he brought that out of his own accord or if they'd told him to. He just ran in and hugged me. I don't know if he cried. I can't remember. He's a very sort of practical and rational person, and I think that in that moment, especially in that moment and the many moments to follow, he really sort of assumed the role of sort of manage all practical things, be the clear-headed one that is going to deal with the sort of administrative and necessary parts of this, because I was incapable. And so, he asked all the questions, he listened to the answers, he knew where we had to go and when, because I didn't have the capacity to listen.
So you guys stayed at your home for the day and for the night, and then went back to the hospital the next morning. Um,
Yes.
just and it was obviously going to only be you and Graham that were able to come in.
We, yeah, I think that was the only time, certainly in the early days, where I saw Graham panic when we woke up the next morning, and we're just sort of forcing ourselves to eat breakfast together. I think he just, I don't know, I just remember him panicking, and he called our friend and told him what had happened. And I don't actually know what he asked him for now that I'm saying this, but I think he just needed, I don't know, he just needed to tell someone and to just let them know that if he fell apart and needed help, that somebody could help us. But somehow we managed to choke down breakfast and call ourselves an Uber. And I remember the Uber driver asked if I was in labor. Absolutely worst journey to the hospital ever. The worst part is that Uber driver actually lives in our area, so I see that van like multiple times a week parked near our flat even today, and every time I just shudder to think that that was the vehicle that drove us to the hospital that day. Anyway, yeah, so we got there sometime in the morning, and I remember they brought us to, I guess, like a delivery suite or delivery room. And then we waited forever. I needed some kind of tablet to start the labor. And we waited for it for 4 hours. And I remember thinking, like, how can this not be the hospital's number one priority?
Mm-hmm.
Like, we're just supposed to sit in this room and just do nothing for 4 hours. I mean, it was like, I couldn't, they kept apologizing and they kept coming back being like, we're looking for the pharmacist, we'll get it soon. I just felt like this is just like, is this not like, why would you have me come in at 9 a.m. or 8 a.m. anyway? So eventually we got the tablet that was required, and very thankfully things progressed really quickly from there. It sounds weird to say, but I was so thankful to just start the process, because I felt so helpless before. At least now there was something I could actively be doing. And it meant that we were moving forward from this extremely painful state of limbo. And once things started, they were quick. The entire labor was only 3.5 hours.
Oh.
And there were no complications at all. It was, I mean, I don't even remember it being particularly painful other than emotionally painful. I didn't have an epidural. I remember they sort of thrust this pamphlet of pain relief options at me, and sort of had me decide which one I wanted to go with. And all I can remember reading on the pamphlet was all these sort of vanishingly small risks associated with the different options for pain relief. And I remember thinking to myself, well, I can't have an epidural because I'll probably be paralyzed. Like, anything that was on there, I was convinced that the risk would happen. So I just said, I don't want any of it. I ended up I don't even remember what it's called, but taking some kind of pain relief that's administered through the cannula, like the intravenously, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
and with gas and air. I don't think it was tremendously effective because it was one of these like self-administered ones that I had to press a button like preempting every contraction, and it's like I don't know who can do this effectively. So I would say it virtually didn't work. But anyway, whether it worked or not, who knows? But anyway, thankfully everything was fast. George was born, and I mean that's another horrible moment is that the silence that followed that. I mean, they just whisked him away so fast. I remember I didn't even see him. I was like facing away, like sort of on my knees, like on the bed. And George came out, and by the time I turned around, he was gone.
Oh,
Like,
what?
it was like he didn't exist. Now, in hindsight, Graham tells me that they asked if I wanted to see him, and he says that I said no. I have zero recollection of that conversation ever happening. I trust that it did happen, and I probably just don't remember due to some cocktail of emotions and drugs. So I suppose they were doing what they thought I wanted. It was very weird to give birth to a baby and turn around and there's just nothing,
Nothing.
nothing there. So yeah, and then that was kind of it. It was kind of anticlimactic after that. I didn't have any significant tearing. I think they put 2 little stitches in, and I went and had a shower and went to another room to recover.
So you
We
really did not see George at all?
No, not that day, not the
Not
day he
that
was
day.
born.
Okay.
Um, they after that they eventually introduced me, I think the same day, to a woman named Sarah who was our bereavement midwife, and she was amazing. She, continued to encourage me to see George, even though I was convinced I never wanted to. Eventually, not on the day he was born. He was born on June 2nd. On the 3rd, we were still in the hospital. They basically said we could stay as long as I wanted, even though there was no real kind of medical reason for me to be there.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know where to go. We didn't know we felt like we couldn't go back to the flat. And so we just sort of stayed until we could formulate a plan. But anyway, Sarah continued to give us the option to see George and encouraged us to do it. Graham eventually went to see him first, and that was extremely hard for him, really emotional. I think he felt like at that time that he was doing that for both of us, and that I would never see him, and that he felt like he needed to go and say something to our son on behalf of both of us. Eventually, Sarah suggested that I might like to look at some photos that they'd taken of George first and see how that felt. And again, at first I said no, that I couldn't do it. So then on the morning of the 4th of June, we were still at the hospital. And I remember I started feeling a bit jealous that Graham had seen George and I hadn't, which I thought was an odd emotion even at the time. Because I kept asking, well, what did he look like? Did he look like this? Did he have this shape of nose? What color was his hair? What did his hands look like? And he's just like, I don't know, Miranda. Like, I don't, it wasn't top of his mind to, strip the baby down and look at his, every crevice of his body. But I remember feeling jealous that like he got that opportunity and I didn't. And so when Sarah came back, I said I did want to see the photos. And so she brought them in for me. And I looked at them, and I remember immediately, like I thought my reaction might be that I'd be scared or horrified,
Mm-hmm.
That he wouldn't look like a baby, that he'd look like some, I don't know, horrible version of a baby. And I was completely took my breath away to see him, that he just looked like this perfect sleeping angel. And I wasn't scared of him at all. I was actually, the emotion that I remember having overwhelmingly was that I felt proud. I felt proud of him. And so right away I said I wanted to see him and that I needed to see him. And so 2 days later, after he was born, I finally saw him. They brought him into my room. Graham left because he couldn't see him again. And they brought him in this little thing they called like a cold cot, horrible, like a little refrigerator instead of a nice warm bed.
Yeah.
Um, and he still looks perfect. Like he literally looks like he could just start moving at any point. I remember asking Sarah what he was wearing because it didn't occur to us to bring clothes to the hospital for a baby who had died, and so, but he was wearing, a little baby outfit and a hat. And she said that there's a woman who knits things for babies that have died, and so he was wearing one of those hats, and this little outfit that was too big for him.
Yeah.
Um, and so I just spent some time with him, and I held his little hand, and I talked to him. God, I don't know. And even now, I look back and think that it wasn't enough. And I'm so grateful that I saw him at all, because there was a long period of time where I wasn't going to. And I know deeply now that that would have been such a huge source of regret for me. One of my biggest regrets now is that I didn't hold him. I couldn't at the time. It just seemed inconceivable to me. But I keep reminding myself that I did the best I could at the time.
Yeah. So you left on 3 days later after he was born, is that right?
Yeah, so I think we left on the morning of the 5th of June.
Okay.
And again, we didn't feel like we could go back to the flat. But while we were in the hospital, they were really kind to us. They they've fed us really well, and they were really attentive. I had really low blood pressure actually, and I actually fainted and fell in the hospital,
Oh,
which was not great. If you were to have this conversation with Graham, he would recount that story as being one of the worst and scariest moments for him. For me, I barely remember it. I do, however, remember the massive bruise I had on my head for the 6 following weeks.
oh goodness.
um, in fact, I would even maintain that that fall in the hospital hurt more than the birth, which is an absurd thing to say. But anyway, so we stayed there. They were very kind to us, and while we were there, we basically formulated a plan that initially we would go to a hotel. This doesn't sound like a tremendously large undertaking, except that you have to remember that this was in the peak of coronavirus lockdown, and only key workers were allowed to stay in hotels. Otherwise, they were completely shut down. And so a very kind friend of ours called a local hotel and explained our situation, basically begged them to give us a room. And very thankfully, they agreed. And I think that was a good thing for us to do, at least initially, because it afforded us a bit more time to just be in a neutral space, away from all the reminders and everything in our flat, and work out what we were going to do next, and just a way to shut away from the world for a little bit. And so we stayed in that hotel for, I think, 3 days. I barely left the room. It's funny now. It's hard to remember like what we did all day. I mean, we never turned the TV on. We barely left. I don't know how we filled the days. I really don't. But somehow we did, and we got through it, and eventually made the plan to go to Edinburgh. My parents own a flat there, and it's normally a rental property, especially in the summertime. But again, because of COVID, it was vacant.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody had been there for many, many months. And actually, my parents were thrilled to A, be able to offer it to us, and B, just that somebody would finally be going there and checking on their place. So it did mean that we had to go back to the flat. We had to pack up some stuff. And so we did so in the most sort of formulaic and sort of, mission critical kind of way.
Mm-hmm.
I made a list. It was very rigid. And I went in with the sole purpose of put stuff in a bag and then leave immediately. And that's what we did. And then we stayed in Edinburgh for 2 months.
Wow, that's yeah. Did you? And I'm assuming you guys just took some time off. You were on maternity leave, and
So yeah,
Graham was able to take some time off, I'm assuming too.
yeah. So I was already on maternity leave, so obviously there was no work obligation to do anything. By that point, we had communicated with sort of the main people what had happened. My team at work were included in that. Graham took a month off work. I don't think it was really ever like an agreement. I think it was his boss at the time basically just said, do whatever you need to do. And his full-time job essentially became taking care of me. I couldn't have taken care of myself. I would not have gotten out of bed. There is a 0% chance I would have done anything. I wouldn't have eaten. It took me months to get my appetite back and enjoy food again. Eating was such a challenge. I made a goal for myself in the early days to eat breakfast before noon. And that was my only day objective, was to get out of bed. I didn't even have to put clothes on or shower, just go and put food in my mouth. And even that would take me hours, hours and hours. Those were really hard days.
Yeah. When you guys were in the hospital, did they approach you about what you guys wanted to do with George's body?
Yes, they did. They very sort of kindly talked us through the different options. I remember we continued to ask, well, what do people normally do? What do people normally do? Because there's no rule book for this. And I think, when you're so blindsided as we were, you have no guidelines. You have no, and I think, for lots of families, religion often becomes, something to lean on when the unexpected happens. And there are very specific customs and traditions around what happens when someone dies. And I think for us, we're not tremendously religious or spiritual people, or we weren't prior to George's death. And we had nobody in our lives other than, grandparents had died, and that wasn't really our responsibility to arrange any funerals or anything.
Right.
We had no idea what to do. And our families couldn't really help us because they're so far away with no option to get to us. And so we were told many, many times we didn't have to decide right away, or at any point, that George could stay at the hospital and he would be well taken care of, and that we could decide when we decided.
Oh, okay.
And I remember waking up in an absolute panic on so many occasions, just needing to know where George was. Like, where is he? Like, who is taking care of him? Is someone looking after him? And calling the hospital and just asking our bereavement midwife if she could just tell me where he was. And every time she very kindly would go and check and tell me that, he was in the, whatever they call it, mortuary or morgue, and that a really nice man named Simon was looking after him. And it did provide me with a bit of comfort, whether or not Simon was actually looking after him or not, I don't know. But I just thought, he's just, his poor body is just locked away in some cold, dark place, and we've just left him there. It like defies every instinct in your body to do that. And it's like your body still reacts as if you've had a baby. It still thinks you have one, and mine thought I'd abandoned ours. It was really, really difficult. And so for that reason, the easiest thing to do was not make a decision about what to do, because that felt very final.
Yeah.
And we didn't want to do anything impulsive because we didn't want to regret it. So we took our time and ultimately decided that we would have him cremated for the probably most practical reason, which is we're not sure that we will stay in London forever. And if we bury our son there and we leave the country, it's like abandoning him all over again.
Yeah.
And I couldn't do that. So we decided to have him cremated. And once we decided that, we were given a date that we could do the funeral. I didn't actually, know this, but you legally must hold a funeral for anyone that dies, including a baby.
Oh,
It was some sort of legal requirement. I think we would have liked to anyway, but I'm probably paraphrasing that too simply. But I remember it being that we had to conduct some kind of funeral for George, which was fine. So I think the sad thing is that nobody could attend. I think it's not like we would have had a, big congregation of friends and acquaintances, but I think it would have been nice for our families to be there. And unfortunately, given the fact that they'd be flying from all over Canada and the US, none of them could come because this was now July of 2020. And so we were given the option to do like a live streaming thing
Mm-hmm.
of the funeral, which we both just felt was really sort of weird and trivialized the whole thing. So instead, what we did was we arranged the funeral. We picked songs and readings that were meaningful, and we both wrote quite lengthy comments to say to George. The only other attendee at the funeral was Sarah, our bereavement midwife.
Oh, really?
She is the only other person on planet Earth who met George. So we felt like that was appropriate. And she offered to come, which I don't know is her usual offer. I like to think that we were special, but maybe she makes that offer to everyone. I don't know. But it was nice to have her there. And yeah, and so we did our little funeral. We had a 30-minute slot. And
Was that just at the hospital then?
So it's arranged through the hospital with a city of London cemetery and crematorium.
Huh.
So we didn't have to pay for it,
Mm-hmm.
which I know it sounds awful to be talking about the practicalities of such a thing, but I know lots of people are concerned about how do you pay for a funeral. It was just part of what was offered, which I mean, maybe I need to go and reflect on that and be more grateful for it, because I think, if financially that became a concern, that would have been another layer of challenge on an already very challenging situation. But yeah, it was all sort of coordinated and paid for through, I'm not really sure through who, I guess through the NHS, the National Health Service, and in collaboration with the City of London. Which and actually the cemetery that we went to was beautiful. It was a beautiful, sunny, gorgeous summer day. If it sounds awful to say, but the funeral was really nice. Like, it was, I think, the absolute best thing we could have done for a send off for George. My aunt had sent me and members of the family this storybook called "Wherever You Are, My Love Will Find You." It's a children's book, but I don't know, it seemed very appropriate. And as the final thing on the agenda for the funeral, I read the story to George. And I always thought about reading stories to him as a child or boy. And so it was just a nice way to end it. And then afterwards, because obviously it's a city-run thing, so there's funerals right. One before, one after, one after. It just sort of is a conveyor belt of funerals. It just sounds awful again, but it wasn't. It was nice. Anyway, there were loads of people outside after who were all gathering for other people who had died, mostly much older people. And when people are cremated, they put these little stands with their name on it in this area where you can come and lay flowers. But nobody told us that, and so we didn't have any flowers. And so George's little stand it was just bare. It said baby George Robert, and nothing. Somebody had put this dried old flower on it from, I think, somebody else's area. And I felt so guilty that we hadn't brought flowers. And then this really lovely family that was next to us, who were sending off their grandmother, Jean, came and gave us this huge bouquet of white flowers and told us that we could leave them for George. And I just thought it was so nice, because I just couldn't leave with his little area being bare. And so they also told us about Jean and said they were releasing balloons for her, and they would release one for George too. And so they tied it together with one and said it was for both of them. And it was just such a nice gesture from complete strangers.
Yeah.
And so that really stayed with us and felt like a really just important way to end that day. And I think we both felt, sort of a sense of closure after that, because George was born on June the 2nd. His funeral was the 31st of July. So, I mean, this is a long time after. So
Yeah.
it took us a long time to just figure out what we wanted to do and then get it sorted. I did feel guilty about that, but I'm happy that we took time to do it right because I don't think we have any regrets about his send off. I think it was the best we could do.
Yeah. Did they find anything conclusive about what had happened? Did you guys do an autopsy? Was that something? I'm not, like I said, I'm not totally sure about the UK health system. So was that something that was offered, or is it pretty typical? Or tell me a little bit about that.
Excuse me. Yeah, so along with everything, I think they were very persistent in a kind way about all of our different options, including having a postmortem or sort of autopsy for George. Um, we didn't need a lot of convincing. I think both Graham and I were very felt quite convicted from the very beginning that we wanted, if there was a way to get answers and information, we wanted it. Um, I think I don't know if I ever said this out loud, but I was fairly sure in my head before we'd even left the hospital that we would try for another baby. And I needed to know that, if there was anything wrong that caused George to die,
Hmm.
we needed to know about it. And so um, many, many weeks later, this was now sometime in mid-August, they finally got the results of the postmortem. It was actually the same day that we were allowed to go pick up George's ashes at the crematorium,
Hmm.
which seems like an odd things to do on the same day. But I remember we drove back to the crematorium, picked up George, and then drove to the hospital to do his postmortem review. And I remember Graham and I parking the car, and I said to him, I said, well, what should we do with George? And he looked at me, he's like, well, we can't leave him in the car. That's just bad parenting. I was like, how can you make jokes? Like, how? And so and so that's how George ended up in my handbag at his own postmortem. Honestly, it's terrible, but it's also amusing in a way. I mean, so I carried him he was in a little box and he fit in my handbag. So we brought him back to the hospital where he was born. And he sat in the room with us, with the obstetrician and Sarah, the bereavement midwife, and we went through his whole postmortem in great detail. They were very generous with their time, and ultimately they told us that his cause of death was growth restriction as a result of my placenta, which was very small, so under 5th percentile. So
Oh,
basically, it just failed to support him. I think it's odd to say that we feel grateful for that result. But I think it's because we now know that lots of families never get an answer and it's inconclusive.
yeah.
And so for us to now know that, this is a thing that happened, there is no reason to assume that it would ever happen again. But if it did, there are things that we can do to prevent it.
Okay.
So what they would do for a subsequent pregnancy is more regular growth scans starting from 20 weeks, because it baffles me that we can literally see a baby growing inside of someone, but we can't measure the size of the placenta. Apparently you can't. I don't know why. But what they can do is make sure that the baby is growing properly and at the right sort of rate of growth. And also I can be induced early. So that basically what we know is that if history were to repeat itself, we know that the placenta was good enough until 39 weeks. So basically I would get to full term, so 37 weeks, and they would induce me early. And I think for us, that was a real comfort because it sounds like this is not likely to happen again, but even if it did, history won't repeat itself.
Yeah.
So and then of course, alongside that, I mean, we absolutely grilled them on everything we wanted to know in terms of, well, what if this had happened? Would this have made a difference? I was particularly adamant about the missed appointments, and had the 36-week scan happened, would this have indicated that there was a problem? The response that I continued to get was that it may or may not have made a difference. And it's impossible to know. That's a really hard thing to live with because I think in my mind, it definitely would have made a difference.
Yeah.
But even having spoken to third-party obstetricians in the aftermath of George's death, a lot of them have said that based on what they see in all of my information, everything was done exactly as it should have been. And regardless of what hospital I was at in London, it likely would have been the same outcome. That's also hard to hear,
Yeah.
but it's also a bit of a reassurance, because I think there was a time where I held a lot of anger toward the NHS and to the hospital for letting me down and that they had failed. And I think, just to set the record straight, there was no negligence. I'm not claiming that they did anything negligent or wrong. I think they had to make changes given an unprecedented situation. It's impossible to know if those changes contributed to George's death. Personally, I believe that they did, but we will never know.
Yeah. How big was George when he was born?
He was small. He was 5.9 pounds, so just under 6 pounds. It's interesting because I had a private scan at 36 weeks.
Oh, okay.
No, sorry, maybe slightly earlier, 34 weeks. Because I was worried with everything happening. I just thought, it'd be good to go get kind of a bit of reassurance and make sure he's growing okay. At that stage, everything was fine. He looked really good. And they projected his birth weight would be 7.5 pounds.
Oh.
So you can clearly see that's, quite a shortfall. Obviously, at some point between 34 weeks and 39 weeks, his growth just plateaued, basically.
Right.
And because it wasn't being checked regularly, no one would have noticed. And because at 38 weeks, as far as they were concerned, he still fit within the range of what was normal, albeit perhaps a bit small.
Yeah.
But it was nothing. It would not have raised any alarm bells for anyone. So that's frustrating.
Yeah.
Because I think, in my mind, had they been measuring me more regularly, they would have seen that graph had suddenly leveled off instead of increasing upwards. But as it was, I was only measured twice the entire pregnancy.
Right. Yeah, that would be frustrating. Miranda, thank you so much for sharing George's birth story. I had one last question that I want to ask you. How did you guys choose the name George?
Right. I came up with it, I think, when we were on our trip in Mauritius. We had a fair, I'd love to have this story that, that it was this family name and it has all this meaning, but ultimately we wanted a boy's name that was easy to pronounce, easy to spell, could also translate reasonably well to other languages. My sister-in-law's husband is Spanish. My husband loves speaking French, and so George is a name that kind of can work in all those languages. We also liked that George is the patron saint of England. He'd be born in England, which was nice. So it just sort of felt right. His middle name, Robert, does have family significance. Robert is the name of my husband's grandfather, who was a much beloved patriarch of the family. And he lived to be 97 years old and was just an excellent member of the family. And I'm so grateful that I got to spend some time with him, before he passed, and got to get to know him. So we wanted to honor him and his legacy with the firstborn grandson of the family.
That is wonderful. Thank you so much. That was good to get to know George a little bit better.
I'm very happy to talk about him. So thank you for asking me all those questions and giving me an opportunity to talk about George.